At its peak in 1944, the US Air Force had 10,000 aeroplanes and 500,000 personnel stationed in Britain. In terms of men and machines, they were the largest combat air force in history. 50,000 of them died or were missing in action. 70,000 RAF personnel also died or were missing in action. This film is dedicated to all the men and women of the 8th US Air Force, the 9th US Air Force, and the Royal Air Force, who lost their lives in the Second World War. In January 1933, Adolf Hitler became Chancellor of Germany, and within the space of a few short months had withdrawn from both the League of Nations and the Disarmament Conference. Meanwhile, in open defiance of the Versailles Treaty, he was rearming. Before long, he would announce the rebirth of the Luftwaffe and the creation of an army more than 500,000 strong. But while Western politicians tried to prevent a repetition of the events of 2 decades earlier, the transformation of the Royal Air Force had already begun. In 1931, Britain had won the Schneider Trophy with a course speed of 340 miles per hour. A few days later, the world speed record had risen to 407 miles per hour. The days of the biplane fighter had gone for good. Clearly, a completely new type of fighter aircraft would be needed, and with it, a new type of armament. With a rate of fire limited by unreliable machine guns mounted on the nose and firing through the propeller, the old system of armament would have little effect against an aircraft traveling at over 300 miles an hour. For Britain, the breakthrough came in 1934. From a combination of Air Ministry specification F534 and the work of a handful of dedicated men came the first of the 8-gun fighters, the Hawker Hurricane and the immortal Supermarine Spitfire. These two vital machines were to form the mainstay of the RAF's fighter command. Hawkers were first, with the Mark I Hurricane making its maiden flight on November the 6th, 1935. 4 months later, on March the 5th, 1936, the prototype Spitfire took to the air for the first time. They had a lot in common. Both were powered by what was to become the most famous aero engine of all time, the Rolls-Royce Merlin. And although the layout differed, both were equipped with 8.303 Browning machine guns mounted in the wings. George Unwin was to become the RAF's highest-scoring NCO in the Battle of Britain.
The Spitfire had a better chance, I suppose, of hitting a rapidly moving target because of the spread of the 8 guns. But on the other hand, it wasn't as effective as the concentration of the Hurricane's 8 guns, which were in 2 close-knit 4s. And that's what made it such a good aircraft for shooting down bombers. It was a very good aircraft for that. And it could take an awful lot of punishment, of course. It really could. It's very solid, but very slow.
In the Battle of Britain, Hurricanes outnumbered Spitfires by a ratio of 5 to 3. But it was the elegant thoroughbred Spitfire that became the symbol of a nation. It was a winner right from the start, with a performance that staggered everyone who saw it. First to equip with the new fighter were 19 Squadron based at Duxford. To pilots already familiar with sedate biplane fighters like the Gloucester Gauntlet, the first flight in a Mark I Spitfire came as quite a surprise.
One of the most hair-raising experiences of my life. It really was, but it was a lot of fun. We were terrified of them to start with, of course, because there were no such things as pilot's notes, which there are today, some of them very thick volumes, but all we had was a little bit of paper on which it had the gliding speed, the stalling speed, the cruising speed, and that was all. Or maximum speed for putting the flaps down and the undercarriage. That's all you had, and off you went.
Johnnie Johnson, the highest scoring British and Commonwealth fighter pilot of the entire war, found the Spitfire impressive, but his first flight every bit as nerve-wracking.
Impressive when it was longer and leaner than anything I'd ever seen before. It was almost like a sort of racing car, I suppose, compared to the ordinary family car. There was no dual Spitfires. I mean, you were just shown the controls, got in and took it off. And certainly for the first flight or two, the Spitfire was in charge, and all my aim at the time was to get it down in one piece. But gradually, after a few flights, things began to get a little better.
6 weeks after the first prototype Hurricane had flown, came the maiden flight of what was to become Germany's most famous frontline fighter, the Messerschmitt Bf109. Over 33,000 were built, making the 109 the most numerous fighter of the Second World War and the chief adversary of the Spitfire and Hurricane. With a mixed armament of cannons and machine guns and a fuel-injected Daimler-Benz engine, the 109 was a formidable opponent. Soon after the evacuation of the British Army from Dunkirk, as a prelude to invasion, the Luftwaffe attempted to deal Britain the knockout blow, the destruction of fighter command. For 116 days during the long summer of 1940, the Battle of Britain was fought, with 700 Spitfires and Hurricanes facing nearly 4 times as many German fighters and bombers. In the skies over southern England, the confused, whirling melee of the dogfight was an everyday sight.
Normally, you got into a fight, you shot at somebody, then you had to break off because someone might be coming at you, and very seldom did you finish up with the one you started with, and unless you got a direct hit on him to start with, in which case, in the case of a Messerschmitt, he would burst into flames immediately because the poor chap sat on his petrol tank.
But whilst the 109 was superior to the Hurricane in almost every respect, the Spitfire was more than a match. Wherever possible, the Hurricanes would attack the bombers, while the Spitfires took on the German fighter escort. So, at the start of a dogfight, the Spitfires were usually at a height disadvantage to the 109s above them.
But they had to come down. If they were going to defend their bombers, which they were supposed to, they had to come down. So once they got down to our height, then we had the advantage in our maneuverability.
109 pilots would try to evade the more agile Spitfires by going into a steep dive. The fuel injection of the Daimler-Benz gave them the advantage over the gravity-fed Merlins.
But apart from that, there was no way in any other kind of feature that the 109 was better. And they knew it. They knew it. They really did. Once you got on their tail, they stuffed the nose down and went for home. They really did.
But it wasn't always as simple. Flying an early Spitfire, P-9546, George Unwin was shot down by a Dornier bomber.
I've been ashamed of it ever since. But I collared this lone Dornier one over Essex, and I was busy shooting him down, at least I thought I was, when suddenly a hole appeared in my windscreen, the bit I was looking through, a clean hole, and up went my engine in smoke. Well, I couldn't quite decide whether I was dead, hurt, or what, but the hole was right in front of my face. But the bullet had actually hit the bulletproof glass which the Spitfire carried in the front and had fallen at my feet.
Even so, George managed to force land in a field near North Weald and was promptly challenged by British troops brandishing fixed bayonets. On another occasion, flying at 20,000 feet and spotting a raid coming in below him, he was too busy watching and waiting, hoping to catch a stray bomber.
Well, what I forgot was, of course, they had an escort, and I flew smack into the middle of the escort, watching these people down there. I went into next minute there are Messerschmitts whizzing around me all over the place. Well, I did what anybody else would do. I just went into a steep turn and hoped for the best. And every time one flashed by, I fired at him, and I hit two, strangely enough. And then I went vertically down and headed for home. And I thought I was very grateful to, you know, make it, but that was my own fault. I shouldn't have done that.
As the battle developed, so too did the controversy over tactics. With Fighter Command divided geographically into 4 groups, it was on 11 Group in the south that the heaviest Luftwaffe attacks fell. Reliant on the newly developed radar system to provide enough time to scramble fighters, Air Vice Marshal Keith Park of 11 Group preferred to send small numbers of machines to intercept. In single squadron strength, they could be airborne very quickly, but were almost always heavily outnumbered by the bomber escort. Further north, in 12 Group, Douglas Bader of 242 Squadron and his group commander Lee Mallory both favoured the big wing. With up to 5 squadrons or 60 fighters flying together as the Duxford wing, the odds would be reduced.
The great tragedy, really, of those days was that Lee Mallory in 12 Group and Park down in 11 Group didn't get on with each other and were not really on speaking terms. And Park, it seemed to me, was always loath to use the big wings, either from Duxford or Wittering, or from even from 10 Group, where there were squadrons. And he always said that he didn't have the time because of the short radar warning and the distance across the channel and the Pas-de-Calais. He didn't have the time to form his squadrons into big wings, but he did have the time to bring the Duxford wing down, or the Wittering wing, or the 10 Group wing, and I think he was very slow not to take advantage of that, of those wings. So the answer really was there was scope for both the big wings and the little flexible formations, and Park didn't take advantage of the big wings.
In September, the Duxford wing, with 5 squadrons, caught up with a formation of Dorniers, escorted by a mere 10 twin-engined Messerschmitt 110s.
Bader went off with the 3 Hurricane squadrons, and this is the only time, I think, since Dunkirk, that Fighter Command Attack number 1, as it was called pre-war, where your formations attack formations without any interference, took place. And he just went in, and we were just sitting up in the grandstand watching these Hurricanes going in threes, knocking down these Heinkels.
George and the other Spitfires watched until there were only a few bombers left before they too joined in and attacked the 110 escort.
24 Spitfires against 10 110s, it was just not on. I mean, we shot the lot down, and that was heaven. I mean, to outnumber the Germans, that was the only time I ever could see RAF outnumbering the Germans. 60 of us against no more than 40 of them, and 30 of them were bombers. But it really was, if it had all been like that, it would have been heaven.
But the big wing wasn't the only cause of controversy. The standard pre-war tactics of the RAF called for fighters to fly in close formations in VICs of 3 aircraft. Used for real in 1940, it was vastly inferior to the battle-proven Luftwaffe tactic of loose formations of 4.
Rather like the things we were outstretched hand, 2 and 2, flying in a loose, sort of flexible formation, with these 2 guarding the other 2 perhaps 400 yards apart. And they were far superior to us in our tight Vic formations, which was thought up by some non-flying fellow in the Air Ministry somewhere, who reckoned that if you had 3 Spitfires, that was 24 guns, and you could keep them in the tightest of formation, attack a bomber force, then you'd have 24 guns aiming at the particular bomber and so on. But it was a lot of nonsense, really. And the people who thought up those tactics were responsible for a lot of young pilots who were lost in 1940.
On the night of the 24th of August, German bombs fell on London for the first time since 1918. The following night, RAF Bomber Command retaliated with a raid on Berlin. As a result, on September the 7th, the Luftwaffe attacked with renewed vigour, but this time its sole objective was London. With the pressure taken off its airfields, Fighter Command was given a breathing space, and within a few weeks it had defeated and so demoralised the Luftwaffe that in the 48 hours following the 15th of September, Hitler had postponed the invasion of Britain indefinitely. In 1941, with the threat of invasion removed, the RAF moved to the offensive, introducing a new form of attack known as the beehive. With a force of bombers acting as bait, Fighter Command hoped to draw the Luftwaffe into the jaws of a mass of British fighters. On a beehive raid over France in August 1941, Johnny Johnson was flying as wingman in a Finger 4 with Cocky Dundas, Jeff West and Douglas Bader. In the ensuing dogfight, Johnson destroyed a 109, but it was to be the last of many flights with the already legendary Bader. Many of the younger pilots had learned the skills of combat under the instinctive leadership of Bader. Johnny Johnson.
He was, as I say, quite fearless, and he didn't like the Germans, and he thought, you know, the more we could shoot down, the better it all was for everybody. And he had the tremendous ability to see the big picture in a dogfight and to hold the chaps together and to reform them after a dogfight and get on with whatever we started off to do. But Douglas he inspired people, and he was a great fighter leader.
Douglas Bader had bailed out of his Spitfire near St. Omer. Without the use of his tin legs, he promptly became a prisoner of war and was eventually moved to the high-security camp Stalag Luft 3. As the war years seemed to stretch ahead to infinity, so the benefit of advances in fighter technology swung from one side to the other.
In 1940, the 109E was slightly superior to the Spitfire 1, and in 1941, the Spitfire 5, 1941 to the Spitfire 5 and the 109F were almost on equal terms. And then the Focke-Wulf 190 came along, which was far superior to the Spitfire 5. And then the Spitfire 9 came along in 1943, which was superior to anything the Germans had. So it fluctuated, you know, from year to year. And then, of course, the Germans produced the jet 262 in 1944, and we had nothing to compare with that at all.
Introduced in 1942, the best variant of the redoubtable Messerschmitt was reckoned to be the 109G, the Gustav. With an uprated Daimler-Benz 605 engine, it became the most widely produced of them all. But the astounding development potential of the rival Spitfire enabled it to become the only Allied fighter to remain in continuous production throughout the whole of the Second World War. With over 20 different variants, and with engine power doubling from first to last, it was hardly surprising that its pilots should have their favourites.
I've flown most of the Spitfires, right up to the 24. But the 2 was the perfect flying machine. It wasn't the best fighter because of its power and so on, but as a flying machine, it was undoubtedly the best. It really was. It was the perfect relationship between power and weight.
It was a beautiful airplane, and it was, I mean, I flew it throughout the war of one mark or another. I mean, we finished up with the Mark 14 with the Griffin engine. But the 9 was the best, and I think it was almost a love affair. It was such a beautiful airplane if handled properly, and it would always turn inside. It would always turn inside any German airplane. And when we had the Spitfire 9, it was faster and higher than any German airplane. She was a lady, the 9.
Like the Gustav, the Mark 9 had entered service in 1942. Transformed by the two-stage supercharged Merlin, it became the most widely used variant, representing nearly a third of all the Merlin-engined Spitfires produced. Apart from a slightly longer nose, it looked exactly the same as the vastly inferior Mark 5, and any Focke-Wulf 190 pilot confusing the two paid a very heavy price. MH434 is a completely original Mark 9 and the only remaining Spitfire never to have been rebuilt. A true veteran of the war, she's credited with a total of 5 kills, 3 of which were Focke-Wulf 190s. Nearly 50 years after she left the Castle Bromwich works, Mark HANNA remembers his first flight in MH434.
Once the gear was up and I got myself sorted out, honestly, truly, and it's not a cliche or just a story, I felt what a wonderful, fantastic flying aeroplane. You do hear this about Spitfires, and it's absolutely true. Of course, part of it is the history surrounding Spitfires, but it's absolutely true. It is a sensational performing and handling aeroplane.
But in 1942, Britain was no longer fighting alone. By May, the friendly invasion had begun. The Americans were arriving in force. Within a year, the number of US airmen in Britain was over 100,000. By D-Day, it had risen to almost 500,000. 2 American air forces were involved, the 8th and the 9th. At their peak, in 1945, they occupied 180 airfields in the UK, with most of them sited in East Anglia. Their numbers had grown steadily, until the 8th Air Force alone was able to dispatch 3,000 aircraft on a single day's operation. It became known as the Mighty 8th. With the 9th Air Force responsible for the support of ground forces, the primary role of the 8th was the strategic daylight bombardment of German-occupied Europe, operating alongside the nighttime bombing campaign of RAF Bomber Command. The Mighty 8th had 3 air divisions, each one an air force within an air force. At full strength, they amounted to 15 fighter groups, providing an escort to 41 groups of America's leading heavy bombers, the B-24 Liberator and the Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress. Although the more recently designed B-24 had a greater range and a bigger bomb-carrying capacity, it was the older B-17 that provided the backbone of the bomber force. The toughness of the heavily armed fortress inspired enormous confidence among its 10-man crews.
Oh, perfect dream. It was stable, it was airworthy, it was combat-worthy. It could receive the most terrible punishment, and still you had the confidence that you could bring it back.
Oh, it was a beautiful airplane. They could take punishment like you wouldn't believe. That the day we got shot down in Germany, we got 3 direct hits with a 105mm gun. Right inboard engine was blown completely out of the mount. The left inboard was pulling about half power, full power in left outboard, about half power in the right outboard. That was it. One burst hit in the waist and one in the tail and took care of most of the people back there. And we flew that thing for 450 miles.
As the intensity of the B-17's daylight campaign increased, so too did the night operations flown by the RAF's heavy bombers. Most successful of all the British heavies was the famous Avro Lancaster. Derived from the disastrous twin-engined Manchester, it came into being almost as an afterthought. Hearing that a healthy supply of Merlin engines was available, Avro's chief designer added longer wings to the Manchester, and on them he mounted 4 Merlins. The first production Lancaster made its maiden flight on October the 31st, 1941. Its performance was outstanding. with a maximum speed close to 300 miles per hour. And with the largest bomb-carrying capacity of any Second World War aircraft, the Lancaster was the only bomber capable of carrying the gigantic 22,000-pound Grand Slam bomb. By the time the last Lancaster rolled off the production line, nearly 7,500 of them had been built. In the early days of the American bombing campaign, the combined firepower of a formation of B-17s was thought to be enough to defend them against the Luftwaffe's fighters. But as the campaign got underway, the strength of the German opposition caused heavy losses. Although RAF Spitfires would often escort the fortresses, the bulk of escort work fell to the P-47 Thunderbolts and P-38 Lightnings of the 8th Air Force. Duxford, handed over to the Thunderbolts of the 8th Air Force 78th Fighter Group in 1943, is now home to the fighter collection.
In fact, they've got
Stephen Gray describes the qualities of the P-47.
The aeroplane is very, very competent. Very, very light in pitch, very, very light in roll, and effectively a very agile fighter. Was very aggressive at low level, very, very well armed, but its main role was at high altitude.
With its R-2800 Pratt & Whitney double Wasp engine, the Thunderbolt was the first American 2,000 horsepower fighter and proved to be extraordinarily reliable. Like the B-17, it was capable of absorbing very heavy punishment. But as the biggest and heaviest single-engined piston fighter ever built, it made a somewhat daunting first impression.
My first visit with the 47 was when I was still in cadets in advanced training. And 2 or 3 of them flew into the field and landed, and they said, "This is a P-47. And of course, with my size, I looked at that sucker and I said, I'll never get in that thing, man. I don't want anything to do with anything that big and clumsy. I want something like a 51 or a P-63 or a P-39. Even a P-38 would look better than that. So I went down to Baton Rouge and they said, you are assigned to P-47. I thought, oh man, that's the end. But I came to love the airplane. It really was such a tremendous airplane. Beautiful airplane. Inside, outside, I guess it looks, you know, kind of raunchy, but inside it's beautiful.
Alongside the Thunderbolts of the mighty 8th was the unique Lockheed P-38 Lightning. The first production military aircraft to come from the California manufacturer, the P-38 incorporated a number of technical firsts. With a US Army design specification of 360 miles per hour, it was the first single-seat fighter to have twin engines, the first all-metal aeroplane, and the first fighter with a tricycle undercarriage and twin-boom configuration. In January 1939, the prototype had smashed the US transcontinental record, silencing the criticism of the Army experts who saw the layout as being far too vulnerable for a fighter.
It then had a lot of teething troubles, wasn't very well liked by the RAF and never put into service. There's a long story behind that, I think. But in fact proved itself to be a very competent fighter in the European, Mediterranean and Pacific theaters. We've been flying ours only this season, and my experience tells me that it's a pretty competent airplane. And of course it has the unique advantage that if you lost an engine, you could still fly home.
With a single Hispano cannon and 4 Browning machine guns mounted in the nose, a P-38 shot down a Focke-Wulf 200 only minutes after America entered the war. The Germans were to call it the fork-tailed devil. The first Lightning ace was the intrepid Jack Ilfrey, Happy Jack. With a final score of 8 enemy aircraft destroyed in the air, Jack completed 2 full tours with a total of 528 combat hours in 142 missions. In a dogfight over Berlin in May 1944, he was credited with 2 Messerschmitt 109s. Even though one of them had collided with his P-38, tearing a 4.5-foot section off the right wing Jack was still able to return to England. Out of a total of 10,000 P-38s built, the Fighter Collections machine, painted in Jack's colours, is the oldest of only 6 Lightnings still flying today. On his first tour, Jack had taken part in the invasion of North Africa, where another American aircraft wrought havoc among Rommel's desert armies, the Curtiss P-40 Kitty Hawk. Last of a line of Curtiss fighters to be used by the RAF, the Kitty Hawk was highly underrated by historians.
In fact, the only reason for that, in my opinion, was that it had a single-stage supercharged engine, rather like the early Spitfires. And if one had been obliged to fight with the early Spitfires through the entire war, maybe the Spitfire wouldn't have the reputation it has. But this aeroplane never changed its engine, apart from on one occasion where they called it F model and put a Merlin in it, but they put a single-stage supercharged Merlin. Had they put something like the engine they put in the Mustang or in the Mark 9 Spitfire, this would have been an unsurpassable aeroplane. It has superb ailerons, extremely good combat performance. It's very well armed. Was a very advanced design for its period. Very simple, very robust construction. And of course was extremely effective and very popular amongst people who fought in North Africa, which were some of the roughest conditions around.
In the Pacific War against the Japanese, the Americans were equipped with a progression of big fleet fighters, ranging from the Grumman F-6F Hellcat to the mighty Chance-Vought Corsair. Great size and strength made the F-6F an excellent gun platform, and protected by armor plating, the aircraft could absorb far more punishment than its lighter Japanese rivals. By the summer of 1943, the Hellcat had begun to turn the tables on Japan's most numerous fighter, the seemingly invincible Zero. As the first American aircraft to exceed 400 miles per hour, the F-4U Corsair was faster than the Hellcat. Mark HANNA compares it with the Zero.
Zero, you have an ultra lightweight, wonderfully maneuverable, almost light aerobatic airplane, low powered, about 1,000 horsepower engine. Highly maneuverable but low on speed. With the Corsair, you have a very powerful engine, and at the time the biggest propeller ever put on a single engined aircraft. You have armor plate, lots of petrol, a very high speed aircraft, but not so maneuverable. So you can imagine that in a dogfight between those two aircraft, the Corsairs would have to be very strict about not getting into turning, maneuvering fight with the Zeros, and that's exactly what they did not do. They would stay at high speed. They would choose to fight the Zeros on their own terms. They would convert height into speed, and then speed back into height again, and they'd make slashing attacks on the Zeros, who with their low airspeeds were unable to do very much about that in a pure fighter versus fighter combat. They could simply turn head on towards the Corsairs if they saw them coming. And the other thing the Corsair could do would be he could break off the engagement and go home at will. And I have to say, when you fly a Corsair, you feel immensely powerful, and you're aware that you're in a very, very potent flying airplane.
But it was the Thunderbolt that was to become the most numerous American fighter ever built. Like the Spitfire, there were several variants, and each pilot had his favorite. Fred Christensen, flying P-47s with the 56th Fighter Group, amassed a score of 22 confirmed kills.
Well, I could outturn just about any German fighter because I had a D-10, which was an excellent airplane. I liked it much better than the D-25, which was heavier and had more automatic things on it that I didn't think that the pilot needed, but for every pound of weight that you put on one of these things, you need 100 horsepower to compensate for it.
The sheer ruggedness of the huge Thunderbolt made it the ideal aircraft for ground attack missions.
Then there was another one I was flying, Schilling's wing. We went into a little airfield, Gelsenhausen, and the group really performed an act on that one. We did a terrible thing there. We just really beat that aerodrome up. I think I destroyed 4 that day on the ground and damaged a bunch of others, that sort of thing. And then after we got through, the rest of the guys in our flight came in and shot, and we jumped up to the top, and the next flight dropped down. Well, when we got through with that aerodrome, there was just about nothing left. There was a big black cloud of smoke coming off of it. That's all that was left. We chewed it all to pieces. But I remember that day. That was a good day.
With most German airfields being heavily defended by anti-aircraft guns, the golden rule for pilots was never to turn and make a second pass. In an attack on St. Trond airfield to the east of Brussels, Charles was flying next to his CO, Bob Campbell.
We made a pass on that aerodrome right down the runway, shooting everything we could hit. We got down to the end of this pass, and he turned around to come back. Well, that is an absolute no-no. I don't have no idea why Campbell did that, but he did. He turned around and came back. So I'm flying his wing, and we went right back down the runway again, and he got hit and hit the runway and blew up right in front of me. So I flew right through him, you know. When I came off the other end of the runway, I pulled up, and I looked down, and here was a church and a graveyard down there. I can remember seeing that, you know, but that was it. And of course, I pulled up and joined up with the rest of them. But that was a real bad day. That was a real bad day for me.
By the end of hostilities, 56th Fighter Group would be the highest scoring American unit in Europe, with over 1,000 enemy aircraft destroyed. Fred Christensen was meticulous, checking every round that went into his guns himself. After 5 kills, he obtained special permission to pinpoint the 8 50 caliber guns at 300 yards. Flying any closer to the target was a dangerous business.
It just makes sense that if you get too close, that if pieces start flying off the airplane, it hits your propeller, it'll put it out of balance, and you shoot yourself down. Gabreski used to come in, and you see the pieces flying back, and I told him one time, I said, "Are you trying to kill yourself?"
But Fred himself held an 8th Air Force record for shooting down 6 enemy aircraft in less than 2 minutes.
Well, we'd been escorting the bombers just before we got to Berlin, and we left them, and I looked down. I'm always looking for something to do. I never come back with my guns unfired. And I spotted the J-52s going into an airport 50 miles from Berlin. And I kept half my squadron up as top cover, and I took 4 airplanes down, and out of the 12 airplanes, we got 10 of them.
On another mission, Fred decided to attack a large force of 48 Focke-Wulfs with just 4 Thunderbolts.
Well, at my age, you think back on the things you did, and you say how stupid you were, but I exploded one, and you've probably seen it in every documentary. It's a Focke-Wulf just absolutely disintegrates. And I flew right through all that garbage, and that white star in the right wing, you couldn't even see it. There was so much soot and oil on it.
But by the end of the battle, the American fighters had shot down 6 of the German machines without any loss to themselves. As the American daylight campaign progressed, the bombers of the mighty 8th were continually sent to targets deep within industrial Germany.
Traditionally, the squadron commander would try to send out crews, new crews, on what would be called a milk run. And my first mission drawn from that purpose and perspective was Durban, a synthetic oil refinery about 60 miles southwest of Berlin.
While 9 of the group's 36 fortresses were being shot down, Ray's B-17 was attacked by a determined 109, setting fire to the radio room. On this, his first and last mission, the right waist gunner lost his arm, and with 2 more of the crew seriously wounded, the B-17 staggered back to its Framlingham base.
When we arrived back at Framlingham, and the armorers and the people who patched up holes in the skin reported to me the next day that they had patched 480 holes in the sides of in the skin of the airplane that I was flying that day.
Then, in the autumn of 1943, came the disastrous Regensburg and Schweinfurt raids. Well beyond the range of the American fighters, the unescorted bombers had to face the full fury of the Luftwaffe for 2 hours each way. 60 B-17s were lost on the first raid on August the 17th. Almost a month later, another 60 bombers failed to return from the second crippling raid. The names Regensburg and Schweinfurt became notorious.
And I always remember meeting them after they came back from Schweinfurt, this ragged, majestic formation sort of fighting its way back, you know, with burning fortresses on the ground, parachutes and so on and so forth. And I think they lost 20% out of that mission.
Unescorted, the American heavies were at the mercy of swarms of Focke-Wulfs and Messerschmitts. The losses in men and machines were grievous. Then, at last, towards the end of 1943, came the aeroplane that was to reverse the situation completely, the North American Mustang P-51B. Powered by the Rolls-Royce Merlin 61 engine, it was superior in speed to the 109G at any height. Above 28,000 feet, it could outpace an FW190 by nearly 70 miles per hour. It could outdive the Focke-Wulf and the Messerschmitt, outturn both of them, and outrun the 109 with ease. But most important of all, it could do all of this over the German capital itself. The Mustang could fly all the way to Berlin and back.
And Goering, when he saw the Mustang over Berlin, said, "We've lost the war." And no truer word was ever spoken.
Intense relief greeted the arrival of the P-51, and as it entered service in ever-increasing numbers, the losses among heavy bombers fell dramatically. With a top speed of 442 miles per hour, the tactics of the Mustang pilots became highly effective against the slower German fighters. Mark Hanna.
Rarely did they get into hard turning fights with Messerschmitts. It was normally the Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs trying to get through to the bombers, and the Mustangs just riding down onto their backs, basically. And occasionally you get into hard turning fights, but very infrequently. It was normally a bit like the Corsairs. It was slashing high-speed attacks, and then you convert your speed back up to height and start again.
Before long, the Mustang had won the battle for air superiority over Germany almost single-handed. With reduced fighter opposition, the scale of the bombing increased to gargantuan proportions. Sometimes the entire 8th US Bomber Force would assemble together.
Yes, there were several occasions that the entire 8th Air Force went on the same mission. And I'm informed, and I believe that I'm correct in saying that when all 3 air divisions were on the same mission, the bomber stream of aircraft from nose to tail was 75 miles long. From wingtip to wingtip was 25 miles in width.
But as the threat from the Luftwaffe fighters diminished, there remained the ever-present danger of flak. Jim KEELAN was shot down 4 times by anti-aircraft fire.
when you got on your bomb run, your final run, when you were locked in, you had no place else to go. They would just fire up and make it more like, instead of carpet, I would think curtain. And just make a curtain in front of you, and you had to fly through it. And that was always probably about the scariest part of a mission, because you knew that it was out there. As long as it was black, it was no problem. When you saw red, and you knew that was right, it was real close.
Jim Cole was ball turret gunner in the 390th's B-17 Bad Egg. Over Dusseldorf, they lost 8 planes from a single squadron.
Well, you know, you look out there and you see maybe 4 or 5 groups have gone over the same area, and maybe at slightly different levels. And the Germans used to have a system of, once they found out or determined the bomb release point from 1 or 2 groups, although they may be coming from different directions, they had an idea, so they had a system that was actually a box, and they just kept filling it in, and so if it was a shake of the dice if you get through there while they were busy filling in the other end, well, you'd make it. But right after we dropped the bombs on this particular mission, a ship blew up next to us. We had a lot of flak. That ship, between the flak and that ship, it took the rest of us out.
The thing that Pierre Klosterman says about it is it's totally unpredictable. You can fight another airplane and you can assess within 20 seconds what he is like as a pilot and whether you're going to beat him or not. But flak, one minute you're sitting in your secure, safe airplane and everything's working perfectly, and then the next thing, from probably out of nowhere, you've got a major emergency on your hands.
As the Luftwaffe became increasingly reluctant to take on the heavily escorted fortresses, the American airmen were left in no doubt about the destruction they had wrought on the ground. Fred had escorted many raids on German cities, including Schweinfurt, Bremen, and Cologne.
Well, I tell you, I was here in 1935. I went all through Europe, and I saw Europe at its aesthetic height. And it just killed me to see a beautiful town like Cologne in ruins.
On D-Day, 144 Canadian Wing, under the command of Johnny Johnson, flew 4 missions covering the landing beaches in Normandy. 48 hours later, at Saint-Croix-sur-Mer, they made history as the first Spitfire wing to land back in France. ML417, the fighter collection's Spitfire Mark IX, was with them. In an orchard near the village, the French people greeted the pilots with gifts of flowers, fruit, and wine. Within a few weeks, the German 7th Army had been drawn into a trap so deadly that no one who had witnessed the ensuing destruction would ever forget it.
The Americans broke out in August on the western side of the battle area, and the German 7th Army was trapped at Falaise. And it was then that the tactical air power came into its own, the Spitfires and the Typhoons, and decimated an army. And the Battle of Normandy was really won by the tactical air forces, not the army. It was won by the tactical air forces, just as Desert Storm was won by the tactical air forces, by tactical air power, and not the army.
For the Germans, what became known as the Falaise Gap had been a catastrophe. 60,000 men were either killed or taken prisoner. Over 2,000 tanks and guns were lost. Since D-Day, the total German losses on all fronts were of epic proportions. Over 600,000 men. Between D-Day and the end of August, the Allied air forces had flown nearly 500,000 sorties, allowing over 2 million troops to land in Europe. With Paris liberated on the 25th of August, the Allies began the long advance to the Rhine. But on the 17th of September came the disastrous airborne assault at Arnhem. For the 56th Fighter Group, it was the worst day of the war. Given the job of flak busting, 16 of the group's 39 Thunderbolts were shot down. 8 pilots came down in Allied-held territory. Charles ROTZLER, was one of them.
It had a lot of holes, big holes in the wings and big holes in the flaps and in the fuselage and everything, but they just got the one crucial cylinder, the one on the bottom. It blew the thing completely off, and my engine just froze up. And we lost, on that particular day, our group lost 16 airplanes, and there were, I guess, 5 or 6 people that didn't come back. We got shot up real bad those days. They were pretty rough.
But for the fighter pilots and the bomber crews, the war had its lighter moments.
One of our favorite gags was to pick up a bomber that was flying along at about 10, 12,000 feet near the clouds. The clouds, you know, flat on the bottom quite often. And pick up one of those guys that was just cruising maybe from one base to another or something. And just duck up into a cloud, you know, to hide from him, and then get on and drop down again and line him up, you know, and get ready to make a pass on him, and then pull back up into the clouds, and then just come down real fast right on his tail and pull up in front of him. See, well, they give him such a shot of prop wash, it'd knock everybody out of their seats. I remember flying alongside one day, and these guys were shaking their fist at me. They started throwing oranges at me.
We always had the old story of little friend and big friend. Fighter would come up, you know, do a wing over, flip, whatever, and say, big fighter and friend, can you do that? And we say, no. We'd reach over and cut an engine and say, little friend, can you do that? No, the fighters were great. Loved them.
Before long, the Allies had gained control of the skies over occupied Europe, and the defeat of Nazi Germany was inevitable. As they continued on their 8-month advance to Berlin, many more Allied fighter pilots would become casualties.
But it was a great experience, trekking through Europe, buccaneering, nomadic sort of life in your tents, marvellous chaps with you, all your own ground crew, all together, one big team, and finishing the job off. Marvellous experience. Most marvellous experience I've ever had.
So, with the war over and half a century elapsed, the days of the piston-engined fighter have long gone. Why then should a small band of men put so much effort into keeping alive the very few survivors?
What drives me personally is a desire to own and fly and just be involved with these wonderful old fighter airplanes. It's as simple as that, really. It's just an obsessional thing for me and for my father. And repeating myself a little bit, the only way that we can increase our collection and continue to fly the airplanes as much as we do, which is actually rather a lot, we do about 50 hours a year with each airplane, is by flying them for work in air shows, films, and any other type of event that we can get.
One tends to think that in collecting World War II airplanes, one is glorifying war in some way. And in fact, they are probably the last gladiatorial steeds, where you went out and actually looked into the opposition's eyes, as opposed to being over the horizon someplace and throwing a missile. That is one of their attractions, I think, but the principal attraction for me is the fact that they're the end of a particular technology, and very pointed at that.
I'd just like to say this in closing, that the unsung heroes of this war were the enlisted men that crewed these airplanes, without whom people like me that flew them wouldn't even be able to exist. And let's give them the credit that they deserve.
And then, as you say, I finished the war at a place called Celle in Germany with Belsen next door. And we didn't know what Belsen was till we smelt it. It was 3 miles away from a place called Celle. And we smelt it. And the doctors then came in and said, you know, they're frying all these people and all the Jews in concentration camp, and we must get all the medical supplies. And then we saw that there was Nazi Germany at first hand, what it meant. So we were bloody pleased we'd taken part in defeating that evil empire.
I was 19. Yeah. Seemed like a long time ago.
you know, you forget the bad things. You remember all the good times and good things that happened.
The squadrons thundered off the ground tirelessly. Off they pelted, those glorious, radiant boys. We were with them in sound and spirit, but that feeling of lead in the stomach when they failed to return was all too familiar. There were so many, and all of them so young, and such a wicked, wicked waste. I mourned them then, now, and forever.